Welcome, Dr. Kwesi Daniels, Department Head and Assistant Professor at the Robert Taylor School of Architecture and Construction Science at Tuskegee University. So pleased to finally meet you, and thank you for taking the time today for this interview for our little podcast at the ACHP. I enjoyed looking at your website for the architecture program. It sounds like such a dream of a program, but an intense 5-year course of study. Of note is the African American History in Architecture minor that can also be a part of it. Such an important and inspirational component for your students. Can you tell me, what is Tuskegee University's connection to opening up the field of architecture to African Americans?
Our program, Tuskegee University was founded in 1881. Actually July 4th, 1881. So our Independence Day is the 4th of July. And we began by 1883 with building our own structures on campus, utilizing the curriculum to do that. And that was the beginning of building trades on our campus. In 1893, Robert R. Taylor, 1892, Robert R. Taylor graduates from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At that time, he now is the first African-American professionally trained architect in the country. And MIT was the first school in the country to begin teaching architecture in 1868. So 1893, he comes to Tuskegee and he starts our School of Architecture. At that time, we were under the School of Mechanical Industries, and he was the architect. And as a result of his arrival on campus, so followed suit the first Black architects that were trained in other programs around the country: Walter T. Bailey, Wallace Rayfield, William Sidney Pittman, and a slew of others.
You mentioned some of the first Black architects. We were going to ask that question more about how they got their start and what brought them to Tuskegee.
So, very, very good question. The thing that really brought them was Booker T. Washington. The fact that we in 1883 began to use our curriculum to build our campus means that you also have to have a quick understanding of how our campus began. So when Dr. Washington came to Tuskegee from Hampton, he came at the bequest of the community. They wanted a school, so they started Tuskegee and then found Dr. Washington in Hampton. So when he came down, the school was actually inside a church. By December, the school had moved into an old plantation. It's called the Burnt Place because in the Civil War, they had burnt a lot of the plantations in the South, and this was one of those that were burnt. And so there were only 3 structures still remaining on the site, but they weren't all that inhabitable. However, that's where they moved. And somewhere between 1881 and 1883, Dr. Washington realized that the strongest way to educate African Americans in the South, specifically Tuskegee-Macon County area, because that was the catchment area at that time, was to provide them with skills that aligned with some training that they already had and would help them meet the needs in their communities. And as a result, that's how the curriculum began to be used to meet the needs of the campus. You know, this idea that I had to give you something that you can take out into your community immediately to improve your community. So by 1883, you had this full-on scale of building. It was the largest building enterprise to happen in this country for African Americans because we were expanding the campus. And Booker T. Washington realized at that point that he needed somebody who could facilitate the growth of the campus, and he sought out Robert R. Taylor. And because of that campaign, architecture has always been this very apprenticeship model. And so for Black architects, it was not easy to find work. I mean, you're talking about the first Black folks trained in this profession, but there was work in Tuskegee, a lot of work in Tuskegee. So for them, when they came, you not only were teaching classes, but you were also assisting in the design of the buildings on the campus.
Are there buildings on campus that are still there today from this era?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I would say there are probably 30 buildings still remaining.
Oh, wow.
My numbers may be a little off, but it's a very good a catalog of buildings that are still remaining on campus. And that by far is one of the most significant elements of both training at Tuskegee and in my case, being an alum of the program, because you are truly among buildings that are part of the American experience, the American architecture experience. We have the ability to use our buildings in our curriculum to learn from them because they're precedents now. Precedents in how you design buildings for citizens who don't have a lot of resources, who need to find the resources in the dirt. I mean, Dr. Washington taught students how to make their own bricks, right? So when you say, there's that old parable, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. Well, Dr. Washington said, if you build a man a house, he'll only live in it once, but if you teach him how to make a brick, he can build as many houses as he wants.
Are any of these buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places?
Actually, our campus. So we are the only campus in the country to be a National Historic Landmark. Yes.
Wow.
And that's what for someone, when I first got started with a lot of this work, I didn't even understand there was a difference in designation between landmark and historic site. It's like, no, that's huge. Like, you have Washington Monument, you have Mount Rushmore, you have Tuskegee Institute. Yeah. So it was, once I really understood the magnitude of that, I realized we have to pursue historic preservation, because I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you can learn the craft of this profession utilizing the context of a national landmark, oh my God, it's a magnificent experience.
It was a no-brainer to incorporate preservation in this architecture program. I'd be curious to know how many around the country do incorporate it, especially the way you do. Gets us excited, of course, but.
Yes, unfortunately, there are no programs at HBCUs specifically that offer architecture. I'm sorry, that offer historic preservation. Excuse me. There are a number of schools that offer architecture, and really in the last few years, a number of us have been looking at the strategies. I know Morgan State University and Hampton University have participated in the preservation and practice program. And as a result, they're finding ways to also gear their students up for careers in preservation in the same fashion that we are. So I definitely say on our end, the value is that we realize we can actually return to our roots. It's so often that the way that you're going about doing the work is you're looking on the outside, hoping to get it right. But for us, we only have to turn in. And by turning in, we get to look at buildings, and in architecture is a predominantly white, male-oriented profession. And the precedents that you learn about, the canons of our profession, are generally white males. So as a school that's educating African-American students, and as an alum of the program, when I came through, it was always, what contributions did we make to architecture? And so when you can turn around, well, you can literally look at the building that you're in first, and say, a student built this building. So it means they must have learned something really well that is still around over 100 years later. And then when you walk up and down the campus, it's like the who's who of African-American architects and the buildings that they created.
Our students that went through the program at Tuskegee in the architecture program, can you tell us a little bit more about some of their more noteworthy projects that we might be more familiar with across the country?
Definitely, definitely. So when you look at the early architects who came to Tuskegee, because of that apprenticeship component, when they came, many came from other schools and then became teachers of those who were coming up. And so you have folks like Wallace Rayfield. That name may not ring a bell, but when I say 16th Street Baptist Church, Birmingham, Alabama, the bombing and 4 girls, that rings a bell. That was a church that he designed. So he came to Tuskegee in about 1898, and the church was bombed in 1960. And so because of him, there was a space created for the civil rights movement to happen in Birmingham. He was also responsible for building most of the Black community in Birmingham. If you're in Montgomery, Alabama, you have the First Baptist Church. It's also known as the Brickaday Church. That was designed by Walter T. Bailey. If it was not for Walter T. Bailey, if it was not for Tuskegee to give him the training to make churches, then the civil rights movement, the freedom riders who came through Montgomery seeking to desegregate the Greyhound bus system, would not have had a place of refuge to escape to until the National Guard could come and protect them. So when you look at that work in the South, that's a direct result of Tuskegee. And then you look at Robert R. Taylor. Robert R. Taylor and George Washington Carver came together to establish a rural school building manual. And out of that manual, what known as the Rosenwald schools. Julius Rosenwald was a philanthropist who Booker T. Washington brought this idea to him to create rural schools around the South. Rosenwald said, I will give you a matching grant. And so he matched the funds, the community matched the funds, and then the state government matched the funds. And they came together and built 4,500 schools approximately from Texas to North Carolina. An amazing feat. And so when you talk about the impact of African-American architects, there would be no civil rights movement. There would be no gospel music. Gospel syndication happened nationally because of Walter T. Bailey and the church he designed in Chicago. There would not be rural education for hundreds of thousands of communities around the country if there was no Robert R. Taylor. And so the list goes on. I mean, the work of Tuskegee architects we didn't go out trumpeting our work. We just went out to do the work. And it was only years later, decades later, that truth of its need came to fruition.
Yeah, that's a incredible context. It's it needed a building, and it was your program that provided the training to do that and to go broad where it was needed back into the communities.
Well, just to add real quick, when we think about education, we say in order for a society to grow, it needs to be educated. And when we look at the challenges that we have in society, a lot of it actually stems back to poor quality education. And Booker T. Washington's philosophy of learning to do by doing was rooted in how do I take this institution that was born out of the community, create a curriculum that can meet the needs of those in the community, and then give them the skills to address their problems that they're having in their community. I don't think that it's not rocket science when we look at it. It's extremely simple, but it's very, very effective. And I think when we look around the country at many of the challenges, that's the reason why we're going and pursuing historic preservation, because it is a skill set that you can plug into any community in any place in this country or in any other place in the world, and you can provide something positive that improves the conditions of the people that live in those communities.
What else can your architecture students learn from these early architects?
I'll give you a really good example. John Chase. Now, he wasn't a faculty member on our campus. He's just one of the architects who designed one of the buildings on our campus, Kresge Hall specifically, with Paul Rudolph. But John Chase was the first licensed African-American architect in the state of Texas. This is, 1950s, 60s, I mean, it's still very, very recent, right? Well, one of our professors, Dr. Wesley Henderson, who's done a lot of work on African-American architects, he even he edited one of the seminal encyclopedias on African-American architects. He gave a presentation once where he was showing the work of John Chase, and John Chase's first work of architecture was a grave marker for his grandmother. Well, that is significant to me because as students of architecture, and I believe this transcends race or economics or gender, as you're trying to figure out how to make your way into this profession, you're always looking at the buildings that architects design. So that means you're looking 30, 40, 50 years into their career, trying to figure out, how do I get my start? Well, when Dr. Henderson brought that to our attention, I mean, light bulbs went off and was like, you just got to do the work. You just have to, if someone has something that they need done, if you've been trained with the skill set to draw it, potentially build it, create it, then you are beginning your path towards becoming an architect, being the architect. And then when I look at Robert R. Taylor, the fact that he graduated from MIT, so the equivalent of an undergraduate degree in 1892, comes to Tuskegee 1893, and between 1893 and 1895, his first building, Science Hall, now Thrasher Hall, is constructed. So you're telling me 3 to 4 years after he graduates from college, his first building is constructed? I mean, it's just mind-blowing, right? So you have that scale that when, as a student, I can say, if you're like, can I do this? Well, the namesake of our school built that building 3 years after he graduated from undergrad. So you kind of, you better step up and move a little bit faster if you want to catch on.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Great inspiration right there.
Oh, yes.
So it's the hands-on learning component for your program. Does it teach trades, like traditional types of trades that would have been used to build the buildings, to make these bricks? Do you go into depth with that, or is it largely more focused on the architecture component?
Another good question. We are developing it. So because we offer architecture and construction science management, it is only right that you have both the very technical, in terms of drawing components to the design of buildings, and the very technical towards the, how do I actually touch it and do it? So what we've been able to do over the last 3 years is offer workshops. We've been able to bring some of the most skilled tradesmen in the field, really with the support of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Hope Crew. I mean, they were able to line us up with folks like Jim Turner out of Detroit, who's come down. He's done 3 preservation workshops, window restoration workshops for us, and a slew of others, from brick restoration to windows. And that's allowed us to expose our students to that side of the traditional trades. And so we are very interested in really building out the programming on that. We're in the early stages. We've received some grants to start a lab to do this kind of work. And so I would say in the next, ideally, knock on wood, the next few years, we will be well underway, such that this, this wealth of knowledge is embedded into our curriculum and is, beyond just workshops.
That's wonderful to hear. I hear that's a rare phenomenon, especially in architecture programs. It's so wonderful. You've really tapped the experts, especially with Mr. Turner, that we know well. Why is it important for architects to understand and appreciate historic preservation?
When we look at the way buildings are, I mean, you can approach it from a lot of different directions. I'm trained in sustainability and in social geography as well. And so I'll answer that question from both of those directions. So beyond just the architecture, because that it's a precedent, I can learn how something was done back in the past. That's great, right? And that's kind of how we leave it. So it's really almost like an asterisk a lot of times within schools of architecture. But if we take it from a sustainability standpoint, sustainability is about preserving resources. It's about looking at how do I decrease waste. It's looking at how do I ensure that I do not waste energy. And so when you look at a building that was constructed, if I take buildings on Tuskegee's campus, every brick that was created, there's this concept called embodied energy. That is the energy of every student who's touched this brick, made the brick, put it in the wall, and constructed a wall out of it. That these walls are 4 to 5 wipes thick. You don't see this kind of construction these days. So there's this ability to preserve a resource that if you were trying to match it dollar for dollar today for what you had that they created then, we could not build it. It would not be feasible financially. And so if we acknowledge the value of the building is still there and all I need to do is preserve it, then that means that this is, you can't get any more sustainable than not having to recreate. I just work with what I currently have. Additionally, many of our historic buildings were designed to work with the natural environment and natural systems. So they're oriented to take advantage of solar gain. Because the walls are so thick, they're able to absorb heat and the walls become a thermal mass. They breathe much better than a lot of the newer buildings do. The windows are designed such that they're actually operable, and so you get convection happening as heat is transferring with cold. So there's some really natural passive systems that exist in historic buildings that we're now seeking to embed in contemporary buildings. Well, we did it right previously, we just learned from it. So that's from a sustainability standpoint. And then from a social geography standpoint, historic buildings contain the history and the culture and the experiences, and they're the identity of a neighborhood, of a community. What is America without the World Trade Center? When the towers went down, our morale went down. Everybody knows where they were during 9/11. And it was imperative that we put something back up that carried who we are and was able to express that. And that's how Freedom Tower came about, right? Well, the same is true for the churches and the schoolhouses and the homes that are within our communities. They carry with them the identity of those communities. This is where people had their first kiss. This is where people got married. This is where people graduated and earned GEDs. This is where they had that school dance. This is where greats like Rosa Parks got her start. Or if you look at Auburn Avenue, this is where Dr. King and his family grew up, how he was made. So if you really want to be able to understand American society, any particular society, but in American society, if you want to understand how we have taken shape, how communities have been able to grow, it's through preservation of these spaces and understanding how they were able to do the work that they did during their time that we can glean so much knowledge and wisdom on how we can address the things that we're dealing with today.
It's just an amazing program that you have. Just looking at the course list, and obviously it's an intense program over 5 years with the pre-architecture component to it, but the way your program incorporates history and preservation and your school's history and Mr. Washington, and it's just what an amazing experience these students are able to have. And I know you too are a graduate of the program and teaching this next generation. It's just so inspiring. I can't wait for the opportunity to come visit you all in Tuskegee.
Hey, we welcome you. We are open campus. I look forward to when COVID is no longer around so we can begin to welcome everyone back. It is a magnificent campus. and it truly tells you what is inside the human spirit, what it looks like when ingenuity meets need and necessity, and what it looks like when American people, all people come together, all races come together, because we're talking about, folks like Julius Rosenwald, Jewish philanthropist, and Booker T. Washington, an African-American man who came up out of enslavement, coming together and helping to establish elements of Tuskegee, but going on into the community and establishing schools all throughout the country, and actually transforming people socially through that engagement, that collaboration. Those stories reside on our campus. Those stories reside in so many other campuses around this country. But yes, I look forward to when COVID is gone, so that you can visit and you can get that personal tour of Tuskegee.
We can get those students touching those buildings and learning all those materials and sciences in person. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, well, goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniels, for your time today. And best wishes for the remainder of the school year.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.